Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture for July 2015. I'm Ed Zimmer, Lincoln City Historic Preservation Planner, and I'm presenting today Boomtown Boys, Lincoln's Young Architects of the 1880s. I've chosen this topic because the 1880s were a decade when the city's population exploded. It grew from about 13,000 to 55,000 in that single decade. And with that growth came lots of building opportunities, and with lots of building opportunities came lots of architects. And so I want to talk about some of the architects that came into Lincoln. Some stayed for decades after and had a major impact on the city. Others were here just a few years and either went off elsewhere, or several tragically died very young after their early years in Lincoln. So I'll try to introduce some familiar figures, but particularly today I'm going to try to introduce some folks that I've barely heard of and maybe you've never heard of at all. And if I look back to the Lincoln City Directory to kind of frame this question of 1873, one of the very first directories done after the city was founded in 1867 to be the state capital, we see only 3 architects listed in 1873. And only one of those, the last one listed, A. Roberts, Artemus Roberts, was going to stay on and have a major impact in the new city. By 1883, we're listing 4 architects. A. Roberts, Artemus, is still in the city, and James Tyler, who's going to build some major buildings, has also come into the city. J.J. Butler, who had been on the earlier list, was still in Lincoln. T.D. Allen is someone who's a mystery to me, and I haven't solved whether he gave us any buildings we would recognize or not. By the end of that decade, and this is the 1886, so not even to the end, we have 6 architects listed, Gray and Placey in a partnership, John Hawkins, John H.W. Hawkins, who's going to come into town in the mid-1880s and do a tremendous amount of work, Roberts and Tyler, again listed. And then by the end of the 1880s, the end of the decade, there are fully a dozen architects operating in Lincoln. And we'll see works by Craddock, Ellis, F.C. Fisk, Ferdinand Fisk, probably the most impactful of all of these early figures. He stays and practices in Lincoln until 1930, is already in town. William Gray, John Hawkins, George Peters, and I'll show you 2 or 3 buildings by Peters that I've just recently learned about. Placey, who had been partnered with Gray on the earlier list. Roberts is now briefly joined by A.W. Woods, a young architect who had come into Lincoln, and there's James Tyler again. So I'm going to step back and begin with those earliest figures to kind of set the scene for the 1880s. And the earliest I know of an architect coming and settling and staying with an impact in Lincoln was Artemus Roberts. He came as a young man, not yet 30 years old, about 1870. He was probably as much carpenter when he first arrived in Lincoln as he was architect. And he practices here up to 1907, when he retires at a good ripe age down to Florida, where he runs a citrus farm, settles in the community of Dade City, and builds a tremendous number of buildings there in his kind of second career as architect. Comes back to Lincoln a couple times to work for his sons. One of his sons was Roberts of Roberts Dairy, and we have buildings down on about 20th and N Street that Artemus designed in his very late years for his son, J.R. Roberts, for the dairy. He lives to 104, so I'm aspiring to look like and live like Artemus Roberts. One of the very first buildings he designs for the community was the original Lincoln High School of 1871. This is the Lincoln High that stood on the Pershing Auditorium site and operated there until the new Lincoln High, now a century old, was built on 21st and J Streets. In the 1890s, or 1880s and 90s, among the many buildings that Artemus Roberts built were the Herpolsheimer department store, was the Herpolsheimer department store of 1890, a fabulous building You can see in the background on the left St. Paul Church. Herpolsheimer's operated for about 40 years, from 1890 to 1930, just north of the St. Paul site. There's now a tire store on that location. They called this department store the Daylight Store because it had show windows on both the first and second floor, and it had electric light. So at night, they lit it all up like daylight. And Robert's best known building probably would be Fairview, which he did just after the turn of the century, not long before he retired to Florida, about 1903. He was in partnership with A.W. Woods still at this time, and Woods and Roberts together designed that mansion, which still stands on the Bryan East campus, mansion for William Jennings Bryan and his wife Mary. Now, another figure on that early list was James Tyler. Tyler was English-born and came to Lincoln to help supervise construction of the original post office in Lincoln, what we would call Old City Hall. And he had quite a career himself, and then in partnership with a son and son-in-law. So we see Tyler and son, Tyler and Brandt as different variations of partnership, and was active from about 1875 to 1919. So he first was working on the U.S. Post Office Courthouse, what we call City Hall, down on O Street between 9th and 10th. In that early decade also did mansions such as John Fitzgerald's Mount Emerald Mansion up at what we would call 20th and B to C Streets, but 20th Street was called Fitzgerald Street, and that whole section is now called Mount Emerald. That was the 10-acre house site on which Fitzgerald had this mansion, facing west towards the Capitol and downtown Lincoln. Tyler also designed Lincoln's first skyscraper, what was called the Burr Block at 12th and O Streets in 1887. It was a 6-story building and was a good 2 stories taller than anything else in town at the time, and had an elevator, one of the key characteristics for a skyscraper. Wouldn't have been called a skyscraper in Chicago, but in Lincoln this was the tallest building, and stood at this height until 1915, when it was completely reworked. Additional height was added. It was reconfigured into 10 stories and still stands at that corner of 12th and O, now usually referred to as Centerstone Building. Another early contributor to the Lincoln scene, although I'm not sure he ever lived in Lincoln. It's ambiguous. In some of the accounts, they attribute him to living in Lincoln in the early 1880s, but I've never seen him in the Lincoln directories, and I think he was actually residing in Chicago and then in St. Paul during the years he was working in Lincoln, but had some fabulous projects. William Wilcox designed the second state capitol building, which was under construction for that whole span, 1879 to 1889. The first capitol building of the late 1860s was a structural failure, and this building was built first around it. The east and west wings were built, and then the center portion replaced the old capitol at the end of the 1880s. And this is Wilcox's work for Lincoln. The cornerstone for this, with Wilcox's name on it, is embedded into the wall of the third state capitol, right next to the modern cornerstone for our beautiful 1920s, early 30s Capitol building. While Wilcox had his association with Lincoln for the Capitol, he also designed the stone church for First Methodist, which renamed itself in the 1880s St. Paul Methodist. This was on the location at 12th and M, where St. Paul is today. Unfortunately, this church suffered a fire and burned down about 1899 and was replaced with the current St. Paul. Another figure who was doing major projects in Lincoln, but I think was really an Omaha resident, was F.M. Ellis, and he designed in 1883 one of the half dozen major churches that were built in that boom decade. First Congregational Church. He built this at the corner of 13th and L, where Cornhusker Hotel stands. And it stood there until it was first replaced by a gas station, and now the site is the centerpiece of the Cornhusker Hotel. But in late 1920s, First Congregational left this site and went off with its sister congregation of Plymouth Congregational and built First Plymouth up at 20th and D. Ellis also designed the original Lancaster County Courthouse right on the site of the current County City building, built in the late 1880s in a fabulous, what they would call a county capitol, beautiful courthouse building in rough stone. And this is Ellis's elevation drawing for the original Lancaster County Courthouse, replaced in 1969 with the centerpiece of the three-building complex that now are the County City and the Law and Courts buildings. And so that was Ellis's most prominent building in Lincoln. And now to get some of our obscure figures. And this obscure figure really is introduced to us first through a couple of wonderful photographs of the State Historical Society, usually identified as the Wheeler House. This stood between 15th and 16th on the south side of H Streets, which puts it right across south of the State Capitol building, where there's a parking lot today. And this little Queen Anne cottage was photographed twice, and I can see why. It's a gorgeous little building. It's like a big Queen Anne mansion that's been boiled down just to its essence and has these complex roof lines and porches and rich ornament. And seated on the porch in this photo, we see a young man next to his dog, and over his head a sign that says H.E. Wagner, Architect, Office Here. And by his proprietary position in that picture, that I think probably is Mr. Wagner. He was a German immigrant who had come into the U.S. in the early 1870s. Must have been back in Germany at least occasionally in the intervening years, but came to Lincoln in about 1884. He first was listed in the city directories as a draftsman for Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, but clearly by the time he built this house was establishing himself as a local architect. And we not only have these two photos of Wagner's house, we also have Wagner's drawings for the house, and he drew beautifully this little watercolor rendering of an elevation for that house. And the pen and ink version signed in the lower right corner by Mr. Wagner. His name was Heydrich Ernst Wagoner, or Wagner. He married a woman from Plattsmouth. They had a child. I would assume the young woman holding the baby in those photos was probably his wife with their child. She died while the child was still an infant, and he soon remarried. He then moved to Kearney in 1886, having sold the house on H Street, and unfortunately he died in 1887, but not without giving us in Kearney another house which we can attribute, I think, very clearly to Wagner by the similarity to the Wheeler House in Lincoln, and some of the drawings that survive in Wagner's hand more closely resemble this house, particularly in the floor plan and the layout, because it's kind of a flip with that big curved porch on the right side in Lincoln, on the left side in Kearney, and one of the drawings that survives takes that position with that main porch off to the left, and this floor plan seems to more closely match the Kearney house than the Lincoln house. Also in the drawings that survive, and I was fortunate to be able to return these drawings from a friend in Washington, D.C. who had acquired them, and now they're back in Nebraska where Wagner's American work occurred, so this is where they belong. He did a drawing for a Catholic church in Kearney and an alternate version for a church. I don't think, best of my knowledge, these never reached anywhere near construction, but they do give us a beautiful perspective pencil sketch in addition to that floor plan on the left, and then on the right-hand side, an interior perspective of his vision for that church, which may not have ever been built, but showed us he was a very skilled draftsman. And we know even when he immigrated to the U.S. at 21 years old, he was already listing himself as an architect. We don't know what his training might have been, but there was considerable formal training for architects in Germany, and he seems to have brought those talents with him. He was involved in the Buffalo County Courthouse, which was built after his death in 1887, but he had been the key designer. And on that early courthouse for Buffalo County, there is a bison head, buffalo head, up on that tower just below the kind of fanciful peaks and below the main cupola. So that's our Mr. Wagner. Another early arrival, and now we're getting to the young men of my title, the Boomtown Boys. James Craddock comes into Lincoln by 1884, still in his 20s, and designs. I can't find much Craddock work in the 80s themselves, but he stays on in Lincoln into the 20th century. This is an early 20th century building he had done in 1902 at the corner of 13th and N. This is where the Sharp building stands today, and it was usually called the Fraternity Building, and really has more of a 19th century appearance than 20th. And he also designed in 1905 the very fanciful kind of castle-like Royal Highlander building. Royal Highlander was an insurance company, and this was their headquarters in Aurora. Unfortunately, this building burned down a few years ago, but this was Craddock's work. One building by Craddock still stands in Lincoln, and that is the original portion of Hayward School up in the North Bottoms, 9th and Charleston Streets. He designed the 4-room schoolhouse. That was the original part of that building. The center entrance with a terracotta surround is Craddock's work. Wings were added to that on the south by Burlinghoff and Davis, and on the north by McGinnis and Schomburg. The building no longer is a Lincoln Public School building, it's condominiums, but it's the oldest LPS built structure still standing. Lincoln High would be the oldest school building built and still occupied by Lincoln Public Schools. I'm going to go back, I missed one there. Listed at the top of the list of architects in 1886 was a partnership of Gray and Placey. They were together for a couple years when they first came into Lincoln, and then both worked separately by 1890. Together, we see them doing courthouses like the wonderful York County Courthouse of 1885 to 1889, demolished in the 1970s. They both designed separately great courthouses around Nebraska, but together they designed a couple school buildings. The original Everett Elementary at 11th and C Streets of 1888 was Gray and Placey's work together. This was demolished in 1928 when the elementary school for which this was built was replaced with a junior high school. That junior high building by Davis and Wilson still stands, but has been converted back into an elementary. And so we still have an Everett Elementary, but it's a 1928 building, not this 1880s building. There was considerable replacement of the big 1880 school buildings in the 1920s, and I've often been asked why that might have been, that these buildings that were only about 30 years old were needing to be replaced. And on several of them, as I've read the school records, they were structurally failing. Some of them were changes in mission, like Everett, going from elementary to middle school to junior high. But some of them, I think, were simply structurally failing. These 1880s buildings were masonry-bearing walls, typically with wooden interiors, and were subject to the stresses that a wooden building in heavy use could be subject, termites and just wear and tear. I know that the Prescott School, which I'll show in a bit, was one that was structurally condemned before it was replaced in 1920. The replacement buildings in the 20s were largely built, well, teens and 20s, were largely built of reinforced concrete and were much sturdier buildings, and a school like Lincoln High, which has just celebrated its centennial of use in the new building, is in fine shape and should continue to serve for years to come. A very similar building to Everett was built for Eliot Elementary, not on the 24th and N Street site where Eliot is today, but a little further north at 26th and O Street, where later a Safeway store and a gas station were built. Both of those buildings are still on the site. This sat on the northeast corner of the 26th and O intersection. It's almost a twin of the Everett building, but Placey did some modifications, particularly to the entrance, in taking the design that he and his partner Gray had done earlier. It was also built in 1888 and demolished in the 20s after the new Eliot was built. William Gray, in his separate practice, designed a couple of fabulous buildings no longer standing, but one of those for Mr. Sheldon, business building at 11th and N Streets. So this would be right on the corner where a large student housing project is now under construction. It was called the Sheldon Block, 1887. If you look on the left side on the first floor, there's a big show window. I think there was a bank inside that corner. And there's a very unusual kind of horse-shaped window on the 11th Street frontage of that building. That was a clue I hadn't noticed, but Matt Hansen pointed out that the well-known Sheldon House, which was up on campus, also, that was known to be by William Gray, had that same kind of signature window. And I went back and researched the Sheldon Block, and there were mechanic liens clearly identifying Gray as the architect there as well. So he did both buildings for Mr. Sheldon and used that unusual window form on both of them. This building was used as a campus building after the campus had expanded to 14th and R, and then was removed and stands approximately where Cranfield Hall stands today. Gray did the Johnson County Courthouse in Tecumseh on his own account in 1888-89, and designed for LPS a school building originally called the Cherry Street School and then renamed the Prescott School. And this is the one that was condemned in the early 1920s before the new Prescott replaced it a few blocks further south on 20th and Euclid. Gray also did the Cass County Courthouse in Plattsmouth, which looks rather similar to Prescott School. And Placey, on his own, did the Washington County Courthouse in Blair. So both of them contributed quite a few courthouses in Nebraska, first in partnership and then separately. When I presented on Mr. Placey just a couple days ago, I didn't know quite what had become of him. He disappears from the Lincoln directories in 1921. I was fortunate to have Becky Martin in that audience, and she got back to me that very afternoon to say that Mr. Placey had died in a carriage accident in outstate Nebraska in 1892. So that's why he disappears. He was not only an architect, but he was also an Adventist minister and had a church outstate Nebraska, and there died after his years as architect in Lincoln. So Craddock, Gray, and Placey, and then we will go on to A.W. Woods, Alfred Wilderman Woods, who comes to Lincoln about 1885, partners for a productive period with Artemus Roberts. But when he's first in Lincoln, I don't have much individual design by Woods until the 20th century. And I know that in the 1890s, when there was a severe depression from 1893 till about almost turn of the 20th century, he's struggling to maintain his practice as an architect and becomes a professor at Nebraska Wesleyan. And the little portrait of the young Mr. Woods in the upper left says Professor A.W. Woods, and he did the title plate for a Wesleyan publication and his name is signed to that beautiful drawing. He was not an architecture professor. They didn't have an architecture program. Instead, he taught drafting and penmanship, and obviously had a very skilled hand. One building that we can attribute to Woods in the 1890s, along with Roberts, because they were in partnership in that decade, is the house called Parkview on the corner of the northeast corner of 40th and South Street on a large, about a 5-acre tract there. This house was built ambitiously in the mid-1890s when very little else was being built. First owner had to sell it immediately, and he moved into a house previously occupied by Mr. Woods. So there was some connection between them. They seem like the most likely figures for this house, which is sort of has 1 foot in the Queen Anne and 1 foot in the kind of colonial revival, what's sometimes called free classical Queen Anne. And there's much of that same feeling in Woods and Roberts' Fairview for William Jennings Bryan. So we don't have documentation for certain that this is Woods and Roberts, but it's my best attribution. Next arriving, and a figure who had tremendous impact in a brief period, was John H.W. Hawkins. And this was one of the first academically trained architects to come into Lincoln. Is here by about 1886, and immediately is getting commissions for some large mansions, several churches. Here we have his receiving vault for Wagner Cemetery of the late 1880s, which has in that big arched front entrance some of that Richardson Romanesque feel that we see in some of his work. But Hawkins was able to design in several different styles of that time. And we see in these, especially the most talented of the architects, that they aren't designing in a single style. They can do Queen Anne with that highly ornate style. We see in Hawkins' work Richardson Romanesque, kind of a neoclassic or a Gothic revival in some of his churches, high Victorian Gothic in some of his churches. So there's not a single style, although Queen Anne was probably predominant among the housing commissions. This would be a Hawkins Queen Anne in wood frame. This was Albert Watkins' house at 920 D Street of 1886-87. And also surviving by Hawkins, a lot of his work is gone, but he did so much that we still have several buildings standing. And he did the Phillips Castle, or the Rollo Phillips house at 19th and D Streets in 1888. This has some of the Richardson Romanesque, but rather fancifully also puts a kind of circular battlement tower on the key corner of the building. In Hawkins' office in the mid-1880s was a young architect from Ohio named George Peters. He also worked as a draftsman for Mr. Fisk for a time, but was promoting himself independently, and here was the advertisement. He had tipped into the binding of the city directories of 1890, George W. Peters. And Mr. Peters, in a rather entrepreneurial fashion, seemed to be buying land, developing housing, building, and then selling. And he did just that with the large Queen Anne house at 19th and Prospect that he sold to the governor of Nebraska. John Milton Thayer was governor in the late 1880s, early 1890s. And after a first 2-year term while living in a hotel, he was reelected, and it seemed at that time John and his wife Mary decided they needed a house and not a hotel, and they bought from young Mr. Peters and his wife this brand new fabulous Queen Anne sitting at 19th and Prospect. This is now the home of James and Marcy Young, and they take great care of it and had it listed on the National Register of Historic Places. And we have some interior shots of Peters' house for Thayer with this lovely staircase and a nice tile and wooden mantelpiece. And we have some decorative tile, the corners of that mantelpiece. And I don't know if this is supposed to look like Buffalo Bill Cody or William Shakespeare. And it probably depends upon whether we guess that hat is a Western cowboy hat or I don't know if Cody ever wore a beret, but a great fireplace, great house, and lovely tile work. This was the only Peters house I knew of until a few months ago, when I had inquiries from the new young family residing just up the street at 1828 Prospect, and looking at the history of their house to give them some clues for the research they wanted to carry out. Very unusual house, very unusual windows and roof lines. That notch to the back has some ornate historic period decoration in it, some brackets, so it seems like probably an original feature. When we step inside, there's a staircase that runs up that long slanted roof line. And in the records, this house was occupied again by George Peters and his wife. That's the staircase. They ran into financial trouble, probably overbuilt what a young architect family could afford. And one of the mechanic liens filed against the property was to a Lincoln mantelpiece company. And it said that they owed money on 3 mantelpieces, a $60 mantelpiece, a $70 mantelpiece, and a $90 mantelpiece. All 3 mantelpieces are still in the house. In fact, they're all on the same chimney stack, which is right at the core of the house. This is the fireplace in the entry stair hall. And my guess is this is the $60 mantelpiece. Compared to the other 2, it's the simplest, but a lovely oak and tile fireplace. Stepping out of that stair hall into the, through the double French doors into the living room, just adjacent those doors, is maybe the $90 mantelpiece. Have to just guess, but it has more elaborate woodwork and a particularly rich tile surround with sort of these, something like fasces bound framing the fireplace. And then in the dining room, somewhat simpler in the woodwork, but some lovely tile work on that 3rd mantelpiece. So great fun to find that we have not only documentation about this young architect and his family residing in the house, but due to their financial troubles, some quite exact documentation on their finish work on the house. And then yesterday, I stumbled on Mr. Peters yet again as the architect for a building called the Waverly House or Waverly Hotel, which stood on 13th Street at the corner of 13th and L on the northeast corner. And there are documents listing that he was architect for that building, prepared plans, specifications, and details, for which he was owed 2% of the total cost of construction. And that building was being built in the early 1890s, but unfortunately, Mr. Peters, on a home visit back to his parents in Ohio, died there in, I think, 1893 or 1894. The early arrivee in Lincoln who probably had the biggest architectural impact was this man, Ferdinand Fisk. Came in 1887, so towards the end of that booming decade, and stayed for not quite a decade until by 1895, in the downturn, he was no longer finding any work to do in Lincoln and went traveling, first to St. Louis and ended up for a time in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Took on a partner named Charles Demon in Cedar Rapids, and then came back to Lincoln in 1902, still partnering with Demon till about 1908 or 10, but stayed and practiced in Lincoln all the way up to his death in 1930. And he gave us buildings galore, many of which still stand, including some of his early buildings. This of 1889, originally home of the YMCA in Lincoln, but later the publishing house of the Free Press, German language newspaper, There's now a bank and office building on that corner. He also did the 5-story Brace building at 15th and O of 1890. This was a unusual skyscraper. It was so narrow, only 25 feet wide, that it had a little bump out on the east side into the next property to have room for the elevator to the upper floors. This stood on the site, the Centennial Mall frontage, or half of the Centennial Mall frontage of the federal parking garage, just south of the Federal Building on Centennial Mall at O Street. And then Fisk goes on and gives us half a dozen warehouses in Haymarket, about half a dozen Lincoln Public School buildings, including Whittier, Hartley, Prescott, Elliott, and mansions up and down Sheridan Boulevard and near South, and a few church buildings as well by Mr. Fisk. So we get this whole range of architects arriving in Lincoln in the very first years, and particularly coming into the boomtown of the 1880s. From Artemus Roberts, our first arrivee in 1870, up to Fisk, who continues and builds in Lincoln up to 1930. So a very productive decade, a very lively time in Lincoln, and some of those buildings still standing. Many of them obviously lost, but through the photos and the architectural drawings, we can still get a sense of what a vibrant, happening place Lincoln of the 1880s was. This was the decade when William Jennings Bryan, John J. Pershing, Charles Dawes, later U.S. Vice President, all also come into Lincoln, probably for the same kinds of reasons that the young architects arrived, a place where a young man could advance fast because so much was happening, and there was little tradition and little established city to compete with. The needs were great and the opportunities were great, and it attracted a lot of talent to Lincoln in that single decade. And with that, I've covered what I know today. I'll know more tomorrow, and I'll get questions and learn more again on Lincoln's architectural history of the 19th century. Thank you.